Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Business Insights room. Every Thursday, Tim Sullivan and I, Maya Matsuoka, lead a discussion looking for insights, developments, and new opportunities for the business in Japan. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the discussions on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Good morning and welcome to this room. Today we've got Rich Young, who is a lawyer and has a long career in the field, but he has been very passionate about the future of mobility. Of course, throughout the world, but in Japan too, because as you already heard, he lives in Nagoya. He also, the other day when we had a meeting with him, he told us that he loves Japan and he believes that probably, the self-driving vehicles will be one of the ways to save the rural areas of Japan and help them repopulate.
Thank you, Maya. First of all, good morning, everybody, and thank you for organizing this room, Maya and Tim. And I think somebody did have some questions in the background there. If anybody knows Cat, we can get an interpreter. It was adorable. But as for me and my interest in SelfDrive, it's really a passion project. I have been a so-called regulatory compliance lawyer for a number of years, part of my career anyway, and so there's an intersection with my profession there, but really this is just more fascination and love. And so let me first kind of talk about some of the reasons that I believe, and I'll break into four groups, that self-drive is coming, that autonomous transportation is coming, is the way of the future. Maybe I'll first talk about what it is a little bit and why I believe it's coming in general, all across the world, and then in specific, a couple of reasons why I believe it's important for Japan specifically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the, I don't want to say the downsides exactly, but there's always a yin to the yang, so to speak. So first of all, on the why is self-drive coming? And the first and probably most dominant item is safety. I was a product liability lawyer for many, many, many years, defending big companies in product liability cases. That means when people make allegations that a problem with their vehicle or their toaster or their computer or whatever ended up causing them some physical or economic harm. And then we looked at the science and the technology and tried to figure out if there was really a cause between the product and the harm. In any case, so one thing we learned is that cars have gotten dramatically safer since the 1950s. But it, airbags, seat belts, shatterproof glass, fuel tank isolation, knee bolsters. I mean, you can go on and on. But essentially, we've reached the point of diminishing returns. Meaning we could put more investment into it, but we're not getting much back in terms of automobile vehicle product safety. The cars are pretty close to being as safe as they can be, unless you make a bubble out of the car. And so what's left is to remove the human factor. And by the way, part of making cars safer has meant making them heavier, because a heavier car is safer, generally speaking, to the occupants at any rate. And there are costs related with that. But so the cars are as safe as they're going to be. The real problem right now, and the reason that tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people really lose their lives and are horribly injured every year in car accidents is because of the drivers. Human beings are not that good at their job, most of them. The typical Japanese bus driver is wonderful, I would say, but the average driver in general is not that great. And the next big reason after safety is efficiency. So self-drive vehicles could be more efficient in a number of ways. Some of them have to do with propulsion model, electric versus internal combustion versus hydrogen, LNP, and so on. But I don't want to say I'm not interested in that, but that's not really my focus, because I think that the market will just pick the most efficient model there. I don't pretend to know everything about them. But the model, there's a lot of discussion in the news. Everybody knows we're talking about electric vehicles, should or shouldn't we? And car companies, for their part, have a lot invested in internal combustion engines. It's a very difficult thing to produce a good one that lasts a long time. Just ask Toyota or Honda. They're the best in the world. But is that the best model? I don't really know. what I'm talking about, though, in terms of improving efficiency through autonomous vehicle operation, is the concept of platooning. And what platooning is when if you ever think of like the Tour de France and you see a group of riders all bunched up, and somebody takes the lead, the person at the head of the bunch of riders is probably not going to. A lot of times won't win the race. They are absorbing wind energy so the people in the back of the pack can save energy and then move forward. It's a strategy. And the same way with trucks on a freeway. If you see trucks operating on a freeway, if they could coordinate with one another somehow or another on their CB radios, and one drive immediately behind the other one, make a row or maybe even two side by side with rows behind it, it would result in tremendous improvements in fuel consumption, using less fuel. Of course, we can't do that because trucks, it's too dangerous. They can't coordinate that carefully. And why would some trucks drive at the front of the pack as opposed to at the back where they get better fuel consumption? But if you move to a autonomously driven system with some kind of a central control, you can easily coordinate that kind of thing. In fact, that technology has been developed. It's in use in trials in the U.S. and other places, and probably in Japan as well. And it requires the vehicles be able to speak to each other in a sense and coordinate braking and acceleration and turning and so on. So that major efficiency piece that I'm talking about has to do with platooning. There are numerous other ways to be more efficient as well. And I'll get to some of those in a minute when we talk about the shared drive aspect. The third big item really is freedom. And by freedom, I don't mean it in the sense of, political freedom so much. That's another problem. I mean it in the sense of the use of time within a vehicle. People that commute a lot, and not looking at you, Tim, lovingly, but he was just in the car, and I'm guessing he was on his way someplace. And while he's doing that, he can kind of participate in this call, but he can't really devote his full attention to it. It would be difficult for him, or probably wouldn't be safe for him to like give a slide presentation or something like that. So when you're in a car driving, your energies are really consumed by that, and it's difficult to do other things. Whereas if the vehicle that you're in is taking care of all that, taking care of getting you from point A to point B, you are free to work or to do leisure or to sleep. And that opens up lots of options about where people live, how they get their work done, and so on. There are downsides to that as well. Some people talk about the contribution to urban sprawl and whatnot. I'm not going to get into that here, but I'm aware of it. And by the way, back on efficiency just for a moment. The way to get most efficiency is mass transit versus personal transit. And I'm not even really getting into that here, although to say that self-drive could form kind of a hybrid between the two, where you had like a shared use vehicle, and it could pick up multiple people. And some self-drive or autonomous vehicles, I believe, will take the place of like nursery school buses that pick up little kids to take them to nursery school, that kind of thing, the last mile, those sorts of operations. So that's efficiency and freedom. The final item is space. And so I've touched on safety, efficiency, freedom, and now space. And how will autonomous vehicle operation and really shared use or on-demand vehicle operation contribute to space or free up more space? Well, right now, because vehicles don't operate very efficiently on the freeways, we have these massive wide freeways with multiple lanes. And if the vehicles were really talking to one another, that wouldn't be necessary. Another thing is we have parking ramps everywhere because people get in their car and they drive downtown or to the mall and have to park their car. So if you imagine a vehicle on demand, I'm mixing up things a little bit here because I'm adding in the on-demand shared use piece to self-drive. But if you imagine calling a vehicle like you would call an Uber or a Lyft or other shared transportation provider, you just pick up your phone, and depending upon your subscription, you call a Lexus or a or a Yaris or whatever kind of vehicle that you are subscribed to or you want to pay for that particular use, and the closest one will get identified by the system and will arrive at your location very quickly. And then you get in the car and you use it until you get to where you're going, and then the car is free to go. So because of that, there is a greatly reduced or almost a completely eliminated need for parking garages, parking spaces, parking ramps, parking lots in front of convenience stores, parking lots everywhere. There really is very little need for that. That frees up a tremendous amount of space. Plus, the roadways can be narrower, as I mentioned before. So those are four kind of high level reasons. And you could do hours and hours of debate about each and every one of those, and about how I've missed some points. I'm aware of that. But with that, I'm going to move on quickly here to the two items that are kind of particular to Japan. They may be true in other places as well, but I think of them in terms of the Japanese environment. And the first one is the aging of Japan, or the shoshika, the kind of the decreased birth rate and the aging of Japan are kind of linked together, obviously. And you've got the aging people in Japan are disproportionately in the rural areas. I suppose that's because younger people tend to move into the cities. There's older people everywhere in Japan, but the rural areas that are becoming depopulated tend to have a greater percentage of older people. And because of where they live, they really do need transportation. They can't get out, and even if they're capable of walking, they can't necessarily walk everywhere. There's a little more distance between things. So they need to be able to drive. And at the same time, their vision, their hearing, their reaction times and so on are diminishing as we get older. It happens to all of us. And so they're having more accidents. Not only do senior citizens unfortunately get involved in more accidents, but their bodies are more fragile, so they're more likely to get hurt in an accident. And all that drives the need for some kind of a safer system in an area of the country where there are fewer people to operate as drivers. And the Japanese government and various agencies have already identified this. They've talked about it. They're planning for it. And so the idea is that self-drive will fill that gap, if you will, provide some of the driving for senior citizens in rural areas. And now, kind of, I got to check here, racing through the clock here. I don't want to use too much time, but I'm going to touch on some of the what I'd call downsides or risks, costs. Some of these things are certain, in my personal view, certain to occur. Some are risks, but on the cost side, I would say, I'm going to put out the big item first, and this is really dystopian, but I think it's real, and society needs to think about this and plan for it. I think this could lead to a further erosion of the middle class, and a loss of faith in democracy. And you might call that a huge leap, and it is. But here's my thinking: if you imagine a world where drivers have all lost their jobs, and a lot of driving jobs pay pretty well, some of them in the past anyway were union jobs. Imagine this world, and you can imagine replacement work for them. And again, various Japanese agencies are already thinking about this, talking about retraining drivers to work as healthcare workers or in other fields. But there are tremendous limitations to that. So I think if we have this world where we don't need drivers anymore, we need to anticipate that the drivers are going to be victims of this. Because if we don't, what we're going to end up with is more of what's already happening with companies like Amazon and Apple and Google, where you get Tesla, where you get extreme concentration of wealth in a small segment of the population, and hollowing out or evisceration of the middle class, which isn't really good for anybody, I think. If I was Elon Musk, I'm not, I don't have his kind of money. But if I was, I wouldn't want that. That's just my personal view. I don't think it's good for, and Japan is definitely a democratic country. It's a collective consciousness here. So that's a concern because the bringing on self-drive not only means drivers will lose jobs, but if you think about insurance companies, which are basically built on the back of automotive insurance, there are other types of insurance, life insurance and business interruption insurance and so on, that still make sense. But there's really dramatically reduced need, or almost an elimination of any need, for automobile insurance when you go to self-drive. There will be accidents, there will be fatalities, but a greatly reduced number. And the way that liability is assessed is going to be very different. It's not really up to the driver. It's up to the people that design the software for the most part. I believe that's what most liability systems will resolve to. And therefore, insurance companies really don't have much of a place anymore in the future. And by the way, if you think I'm crazy, I've been talking about this since 2010 to insurance companies, and they are aware of it. They don't talk about it a lot, but they are thinking about it. Although, just like with blockbuster movie rentals, being aware of a risk on the horizon doesn't necessarily mean you do the right things to plan for it. Another big cost in this, or a group that we heard, police. If you think about highway patrol, this is a whole system that was really developed to deal with individual drivers and cars. And when you've got obedient cars following an algorithm, there isn't the same need for that. Emergency rooms, for the most part, their biggest customers are related to automobile-related problems. There's still need for medical care, obviously, but I think that need will be greatly reduced. And we as a society need to anticipate all that stuff. Otherwise, it leads to an erosion, I think, of the middle class, which could really have problems for Japan. And then next is those are things that kind of happen passively, I guess. These things will occur, and they are costs. The next two items would be what I'd call risks, and they're both related to cyber. One is it's not a risk; it's a loss of privacy. I mean, it's a fact. We already are tracked everywhere on our phones, and if you don't think that's true, you probably should be in a different conversation. But we are. I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything, and I'm not suggesting that some big corporate entity is really interested in my personal movements and watching me. But that information is out there, and anybody that works with data knows that it's become increasingly possible to sift through that and identify either individual movements or group tendencies that result in useful information. So that's something that will be used, and we need to think about that as a society, decide what to do about privacy. The next two are a little scarier. They're hijacking and weaponization of vehicles. And right now, if you imagine all the cars on the road, they're all driven by individuals. So if you most of us aren't that great at driving. We're pretty good, and we try to do the right thing. But if you were able to hijack the system, and Maya's driving her vehicle, and you could tell Maya's vehicle, no, don't take her to the 7-Eleven, take her to the Kominkan or whatever. That would be kind of a shock, and that kind of thing is technologically possible, of course. So we as a society need to think about how we can do that. And this one may sound crazy as well, but imagine if vehicles like drones could be turned into a group of weapons, which is entirely possible. So some outside force, an evil state or an evil group that wanted to mess with people in Japan could take the vehicles, control them through the software, and create chaos. And again, I don't mean to be dystopian or suggest I think this is absolutely going to happen. It's just a risk that needs to be considered when coming up with regulation and developing technology and so on. So I kind of raced through the big topics. There's a lot to say about each of those, but I wanted to stop there and see if anybody's still in the room even.
Rich, yes, this was really great. I mean, there are quite a lot of aspects which I hadn't thought of, and you put them together systematically in a very nice order. And while there are, benefits and let's say advantages and disadvantages, there are certainly, things which we still need to work on so that we can ensure that we safely actually use the self-driving vehicles. And I can see, I was just doing something, in the background, and I'm not sure whether you touched upon this. And if you did, I apologize. But I can see how if we manage, or if Japan and other countries manage to actually create that model of efficiency, we can also hope that the number of vehicles on the roads will be reduced, which of course would once again lead to, let's say, reduced use of resources. Because as we can see, the problem nowadays is, of course, everybody's talking about climate change, but another problem which very few corporations or people talk about is the limited amount of resources we have. And if we manage to reduce the number of vehicles, hopefully we can also reduce the number of the amount of resources we need to run them.
Well, Maya, actually, I think that was your very gentle way of reminding me that I forgot a really key point, and I did completely forget it. But you're exactly right. Moving to first of all, in terms of self-drive or autonomous vehicles, there are kind of two big competing models, and I'll tell you which one I lean towards. And the models are the Tesla model, which is you own a car just like you do today, or 2 cars or 3 cars, however many cars you want to own. And the only difference is the car drives itself for you whenever you want it to. And there are reasons for that. I mean, people like to be able to drive where they want to, and they like to, make the car smell the way they like it. And so there are understandable reasons for that. The competing model is a shared use model. And I think that's the way it should go, partly for the reasons that you mentioned, and other reasons as well. But if you think about a shared use model, you move from vehicles being used, 5, maybe 2 to 5, or maybe 10% of the time, cars that are used for commuting and so on. Most of the time, they're sitting parked someplace, which is a tremendously inefficient use of the resources, and they wear out just for aging, not because they're being used. Whereas if you have a shared use vehicle, it's going to be in use, actually moving people from A to B 90% of the time, and the system will tell it to go and get maintenance when it's needed. It'll be fueled and be clean all the time, and similar, and so you'll need fewer vehicles because the vehicle's always in use. It's not parked someplace, which is what frees up the parking lots. But not only will you have fewer vehicles, but if you imagine now for the same, let's say you have a subscription for I'll use dollars because I'm just recently moved from the U.S. But let's say it's a $20,000 subscription per year, and you figure that's your vehicle cost. That's what it was costing you before for insurance and fuel and everything. Um, the shared use model, you would get much more vehicle for that because you're only paying for the time that you use it. It's not as though Maya and Timothy and Azarel and Luke and I, whoever, have together bought a car and are sharing it. It's a very different thing than that. It's that we are conceptually subscribing to the right to use a vehicle on demand when we want it. So it's a flexible model. But it means dramatically fewer cars. It also means that each individual car can be much nicer and is likely to be much nicer, be safer, even though the likelihood of collision is greatly reduced. They can be made safe, much more elegant, beautiful. Imagine every car is $1 million car instead of a $20,000 car, which is, I think, the way it would likely move to, kind of like with Shinkansen trains. They're used all the time, so they're made perfectly to last a long time. And so that will mean fewer cars on the roads. But the flip side of that is, in addition to the driver jobs and insurance companies and police and ER jobs that will be lost, I think car companies are in for a major restructuring. And I don't know how that's going to shake out, honestly. But in terms of, instead of in the U.S., I think it used to be 13 to 17 million new cars were sold every year. That number will go down dramatically, I believe, when cars are shared use. So thank you, Maya, for reminding me about that. I missed the point.
Oh, you're welcome. Another point which is related to what you just said, that there will be, risks actually with the adoption of self-driving vehicles and so on. I just wonder how it will play out in Japan, because yesterday in your post on LinkedIn, you mentioned that, Japan is one of the first countries, or maybe the first one, to allow self-driving vehicles on the road, of course, on its roads. And well, there are, of course, there is a discussion about the level of autonomy. I know about that, but just let's put that apart for the moment. I just wonder how it will play out in Japan, because the society here is really risk averse. And, at the very moment, people and also the policymakers, they hear that there is the lowest chance of people being injured or killed, they immediately just go into the opposite direction.
Mhm.
Right? And
Yeah.
so that's something which I believe might take a little bit longer than other countries, to accept here in Japan. So it's a very interesting thing to see how it plays out.
That's a great point. I don't feel like I know the answer to that at all. But, Japanese people I think, are risk adverse, and older people tend everywhere in the world to be more risk adverse in general.
Mhm.
And I think what will drive this is need more than opinion. And yeah, my hope is that the Japanese government will take a part in this, because uh, I am a little concerned that if it's left entirely to industry, that it will erode the middle class even more than it would otherwise. I think the government needs to be a part of it. And I don't know. I mentioned that change in the laws, which you noted in the LinkedIn piece, and Azrael, I think he asked a question about that as well. He, I'm sure, knows a lot more about that than I do. I just saw it in a Japan Times article, actually, and I've since taken a look at MIDI websites and so on. It's complicated. I don't know the state of the law, but in areas like this with new technology, oftentimes the companies will seek to ask forgiveness more than permission. They'll just go out there and do things, and we may start to see that happening. I think even now there are some autonomous vehicles happening in Japan, and there's that woven city concept that Toyota's behind, which is very interesting. And a trial like that might go a long ways towards making people understand that the risk is not quite what they fear. Thank you.
Yeah. So Azarel and Timothy Langley, look, if you have let's say insights or comments about this, please just don't wait.
Sure.
To
You mind if I jump in?
Not at all.
Okay, I think a good case can be made that even though there are risks involved, it is a less risky option than the scenario we have right now. Two people were killed just this week with a girl who was playing with a parakeet in her car. We're having old people mistaking the accelerator for the brake and the brake for the accelerator, and I think I think a good case can be made for the enhanced safety and convenience, and I think particularly what Japan needs is autonomous vehicles for trucks, because the trucks that are coming in to feed the cities just really clog it up. I drive every day, so I see it particularly when I'm coming home at night. They flood the night roads because they kind of convoy in when the traffic is down. But if you're driving during that period of time, all you're seeing are trucks, and you can imagine how much efficiency would be gained by moving it to the industrial area of truck drivers. And I think that could be done very efficiently. And wow, what a different world that would be. It'd probably launch from trucks, and yeah, I think it's just right around the corner, as you've said, Rich. And finally, yeah, I work with the government quite a bit. I would not expect the government to do much on this. I think it's industry needs to drive this. The automobile companies should be behind it. And the other thing is the 5G. Once 5G really becomes embedded throughout the business areas and wider, I think the possibilities and opportunities for autonomous vehicles will become more of a reality.
Azarel, thank you, Timothy. And Luke, yes, Azarel.
Yeah, I don't want to. I mean, let me play the devil's advocate with you, Rich. I think it will not be in our lifetime, and I don't think it'll be in our kids' lifetime either. And the reason for that, Japan just moves. Like sometimes when you're in the eye of the storm, everything seems perfect, and Japan's wow, and like technology and blah blah blah. But I just think move too slow. And sometimes that's good, but then they can be left behind. And then classic example is the situation of the electric cars here in Japan. There was a NHK article of somebody wanting to contribute to the environment, decides to buy an electric car, runs out of, he's living in Tokyo, mind you, runs out of battery, can't get his car charged, negative press like this. He tries to get the electric recharge station put in his mansion. He's the only owner of an electric car plug or station, and the sheer cost of the building's governing body to put in an electric station was over, I think it was like something like 10 million yen. And so I just think, yeah, things just moving slowly. I do know that when Japan decides to move, it moves very quickly. But I go back to what Timothy was just saying. That's Timothy with the mustache. That the government just does not move unless industry moves. If Toyota moves, then the government will support. And I was speaking with a major automotive company just yesterday. I'm in innovation, so I have a really good. I'm beginning to have a very good feeling of how things play out, but. They spend 90% of their budget is on R&D for overseas markets, and Japan is kind of like 10%. It's nearly like an afterthought, and I was amazed, So when budgets are allocated for overseas expansion and sales and things like that, it made me think, well, what are they doing to innovate and make Japan change? It's only 10% of their budget. Hang on, that doesn't sound so great for Japan, considering the headquarters here and that. And so I think there's a lot of things that are pointing towards what you're saying, but I just think it's so far down the track, and you start to think about how do you allocate lane space and or if it might even not even take cars off the road. It might actually even things just might stay the same, autonomous trucks, but you still got to have the physical truck on the road somewhere. So I think there are still a lot of things to play out over a long period of time.
Azarel.
Hi, morning. So many topics to talk about that I actually forgot half of them. I mean, half of the one they wanted to talk about. But just want to say first about Rich, make a point about the difference between private and public vehicles. I think that is very unlikely we will have private vehicles, at least for the following decades. I mean, when it comes to autonomous vehicles, mainly because cost and supply limitations. The point of the automotive companies and in general most of the governments is to make them public, and I think it makes more sense. But I think we're still at least years away for having some sort of implementation and decades away of having massive implementation, if ever. But I think that there are a few things here to notice. The first thing is that coming back to the title of this talk about mobility, we are talking about autonomous vehicles, which is a tiny part of mobility. Because it's a tiny part, and it should be a tiny part. We need to consider the whole mobility environment about not only what is going into the automotive technology developments, but also how other developments in technologies, and not only technologies, but business models, such as mass, etc., can actually support or integrate the autonomous vehicles into that. I think that's the current trend, but these models so far, they have failed terribly, and the Japanese government is one of the only places where I am actually involved on precisely see what actually works and what doesn't. And this is still not fully answer of this because most of the mobility technologies, particularly in Japan, are actually industry driven. So we have automotive OEMs that they are literally pushing their products and their services into the market, but people don't actually ask for them. I mean, we are having an overflow of over-engineered technologies, whereas people actually want more simple solutions. And what they actually want is a reliable public transport or a reliable infrastructure. And Japan so far has been able to provide both of them. But because the current situation, as the Japan economy and demographics are changing, the situation is actually changing. So I'm actually more concerned about how the business model and how actually the government involvement in Japan, again, in Japan, not in the US, but in Japan, is actually evolving to that. I think I am more concerned about how, for example, Japanese government is still requiring any transport company in Japan to be profitable in order to not depend upon subsidies. While at the same time, the Japanese government is giving generous subsidies to autonomous vehicles or to development of rolling out new technologies. And I'm very much happy to have the Japanese government involved that heavily into trying new technologies, because I think we should look forward the futures. But without a change on how we envision our mobility model, the technology itself will not change anything. So I think this is a very important point. Um, um, on that, if someone wants to add something, I actually welcome any comment.
Well, look, and Azrael, to your points, Rich, sorry to interrupt you, but I was just thinking, look, what you said, it is the government doesn't move unless the industry moves. So, and then what Azrael said, that people actually are not looking for these technologies at the moment. Does it mean that we need to educate the population? Of course, the changes are happening, the demographic changes are happening here, and Japan doesn't have a lot of choices, but still, probably it's at the end of the day, it is, the idea of popularizing these new models.
That's off you guys. Dozo.
Hey. So I think there's another comment I wanted. This was my next comment, and it's in line with this. I think it was Rich or Timothy. I don't remember. They mentioned that or maybe it was Maya. Sorry, if so, the Japanese public is very conservative, so introducing these technologies is a hard thing. Now, I do agree. I mean, I work in a company doing these kind of new technologies, and I'm actually the first one to go into the field. So I do agree, Japanese public and general people are conservative, but they are also kidnapped by how the government decides their framework. And the government, although the government is also conservative, there is a huge vinculation with the industry in the country. So basically, the K.N. or the mobility industries or whatever industry meets the government, and the normal people have absolutely no word about it. I mean, they can have a word, but the nemawashi works in only one way with all these selected people. So the thing is that the Japanese people will probably be happier if in rural areas, for example, the government will provide subsidies to keep their buses running, or provide mobility solutions that can be actually different from buses, but they can work. But however, the Japanese government has made clear that mobility in Japan is not a social services; it's an industry. As such, laissez-faire. So they are not providing much support because it's a business, it's a private matter that indeed has some public repercussions. So I think conservatism is as less important as the number of choices there are. People are actually left because the government has these policies. And I want to make sure that I am not saying this is a bad or good policy. This is the policy. I am not saying this is good or bad, because I am not the one who should assess. I think this policy responds to a certain historic and certain vision that is just different from other countries. But I think this is important because I go a lot to rural areas for my work, and most of the developments I do are either in rural or in urban areas. And the thing is that when you go to places like, for example, last week or 2 weeks ago to Shizuoka, you go to Shimizu-ku, and the thing is that Shizuoka is actually a large city for international standard. For Japan, it's not that large. So the thing is that what I was running a new service for an on-demand service, and there was nothing there. There was just a single bus that come every hour because, well, they need to make money and they need to reduce subsidization. So if you ask the people there, they will probably tell you, oh, we would like to have a reliable bus, but we don't have that. So now we need to pay for every taxi ride because this is the best thing we can do with the current framework.
I was just going to say before that just quickly, about the government situation. I agree with Azrael. I think it has to be profitable. And to go back to something that Rich said before, a way of showcasing what the possibilities are, and showing the public and the government what is possible if industry does want to showcase something, is that the Woven Toyota city that they're planning. I think it's a really great point. I mean, SoftBank has just won a contract to develop something similar for the startup community in Nagoya as well. So that there's a lot of investment and planning going on for the Nagoya region. So it's really good for you down there, Rich. But it just shows that industry, if they come together and they can showcase what is possible for mobility, whether that be cars or other transport, then I think that will then filter on out into Osaka and Tokyo and other outlying regions. And at that stage, the technology will be at a stage that it will be able to implement it into other cities a lot more, hopefully safer and with less risk, because it's already been worked out in a hub that everyone's been able to see that it's actually been proven. That's neat.
Luke, can I make a comment or?
Yes.
Okay. And there's one thing about what you say that I am truly concerned. And with all my love to smart cities and things like that, and the Japanese government has a whole initiative on the smart and the super cities, there is one concern I have on this, and is that it is unlikely that you can actually export the whole feature of, for example, say, woven city or any city made by scrap. The reason is that one is because technology is, by definition, exclusive, not inclusive. That means that you're in woven city, and you are in, or you're left out. And the thing is that there are definitely things that we can learn from these living labs, and that's why I think they're a very interesting idea, and we can exploit some of them and adapt to other places. But the whole concept as a whole, we need to think about who is developing this place and what for. What are the goals? What are the goals of the normal cities? I mean, any city. What's the governments provide on that goal, right? And when you think about what is the role of technology, actually comes down into a very, very, very late stage. And whereas in smart city development, technology is essential. It's a key. It's a technology-driven solution. It's a technology-driven development. So how much of that technology is actually impacting our life? Again, I think we are sometimes over-engineering everything just for the sake of of basically the industry. I mean, everyone, of course, wants to keep their own business alive. And I think many businesses provide very interesting solutions. But often for mobility and for these kind of solutions, we need to come down about like what actually is the goal, what actually we need, and rather what we can provide.
I'd like to make a quick comment about Woven City. The first disclaimer is that I don't really know anything about it at all, other than what I've read. I don't have any contacts there, and then I can apply a little bit of my just generic experience over time. But my sense, and by the way, Luke, unfortunately for me, Woven City is at the foot of Mount Fuji, which is a great location. Apparently, it's a kind of a retired Toyota factory that's being converted into this Woven City. That's its concept. So it's not down here in Nagoya where I am, but nonetheless, I think it is kind of a laboratory concept, as I think Azrael may have kind of implied. And in the U.S., there's Ann Arbor, Michigan, is a similar thing. And so with autonomous vehicles, a big part, and I didn't touch on this at all, but it's communication between vehicles. And somebody, maybe it was Timothy or Luke, somebody talked about the 5G might being an enabling technology. And I don't know whether it's 5G or 6G or Wi-Fi or whatever, but there needs to be some way that the vehicles and other infrastructure communicate with one another. And that's part of the reason for doing like a laboratory city or a test city like Ann Arbor, where you take the existing telephone poles or light poles or bridge abutments and you convert those into communication stations so that the cars can communicate, if not with one another, because that requires a tremendous amount of standardization, at least with with local infrastructure. And it reminds me of a point that since it's a free for all, I'll throw this out there. I meant to talk about it, but there's this company, and they have a funny name. I think it's Solar Frickin' Roadway. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but the concept is basically back to energy efficiency and so on, is to convert roadways using this Gorilla Glass to solar panels. And there are roadways everywhere throughout Japan and throughout the world. And if the roadway was actually generating energy and that energy could be transferred to a vehicle as it was driving along the road, that would be potentially an efficient model to use electric vehicles driven by solar energy. And right now, solar is not a great option for that because it just doesn't generate enough energy. But if you did take vehicle roofs and they didn't need to be super strong for crash resistance because they were not driven by people but driven by algorithms instead, and you could use that space and the space on the roadway, we could generally move to that. And I agree with everything that all the other panelists and guests have said about how things tend to be slow moving. And I think that's just the way it is. They're slow moving until they're not.
Yeah.
And I still remember, I'm old enough to remember prior to Uber being a thing or online shopping. And I know those are not as big of a change, but these were kind of, we take these things for granted now. And they were kind of dramatic changes. And we all, most of us anyway, probably use these technologies. And I think it will be the same in a gradual step-by-step way with autonomous transportation, is that it'll gradually come in. And I mentioned that article. Maybe people don't agree with me, but I think the development and implementation of the Shinkansen was a huge thing, kind of a moonshot for Japan. And there was a time when people said, we're going to go to the moon. And they didn't know how they were going to get there. They didn't know how we're going to do it. They just knew they wanted to do it. And they ended up doing it. And it's pretty dramatic. And Shinkansen is kind of like that. It was basically built from 1957 to 1964. Although there was some, I guess during wartime, some of the tunnels were built. But it's a remarkable development that's still in use today, wide use. And there's really nothing as good as it in the world. We won't get into that debate. But anyway, that's my reason that I think Japan can and will do this. I don't know when, but I believe, and I think Japan should do it as well.
Great. Can I, just because I need to leave soon, I would like to make a couple of comments on that, and then sorry, I will need to leave. About for the solar roadways, there's a very nice video debunking them. It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea, and I'm glad they actually scaled down the things. It sounds good on the paper, but please, if someone has interest, check on Google, and you can find very good articles debunking why it's a terrible idea. About the Shinkansen similarities, I think here there's a big difference, and is that the Shinkansen story, I think, is very great for another Clubhouse talk maybe, but it's actually a very particular one. And the thing is, the difference between the Shinkansen and any of these new technologies such as autonomous vehicles is that by the time that the Japanese decide to go for high-speed rail, there was already working technology on that. So that technology actually existed, and it was refined by the Japanese. In fact, mostly by many expeditions to France and so on. Funny thing is that France didn't develop their own Shinkansen until 1981. But anyway, the thing is that the big difference also is that the business model and the social model. If you mentioned again before that the reason why we do the living labs is because we can test these solutions. Therefore, we don't need to do all those massive standardizations in our current cities. And it's also basically what it's telling me is that look at this, instead of adapting a technology to our society, our cities, to our current needs or future needs, we are literally thinking about making our cities based on what this new technology are bringing. This is fair. I mean, it's a first statement. I can buy you that. But there's the important thing to think about, is that actually going to work? Will that actually make sense? And with the Shinkansen, for example, it was a different thing because there was the Japanese National Railway director at that time who heavily promoted the idea, and he was forced to resign because of that. He actually proved, he literally went to the parliament to prove that this makes sense on the current Japanese situation, on that current Japanese situation, because the business model and the economic model is there. With the autonomous vehicles so far, the only evidence I've seen from academia and from most industry leaders who provide certain data is the opposite. But anyway, I might be wrong, and I actually wish I could be wrong, I think. But those are my different comments on the Shinkansen and the AV. I think they are not fully comparable.
Well, that's a good point, and still, yes, as Rich said, I agree with you. I hope that you are wrong too when it comes to, to applying new models to the Japanese society. We don't know, of course, what the future holds, but we have seen that it's true. Japan doesn't move until it moves, and once it decides to move, then things happen really quickly. But Azarel, thank you very much for coming, for sharing your expertise. I certainly hope that we'll have more opportunities to talk here on Clubhouse, because there is a lot on this topic. So thank you, really.
Maya, thank you very much to all. I need to leave now. I just want to say also that if anyone has interest, please do contact me on LinkedIn. I think you put the link here. Thank you. And there's a lot of, like, as I say, many movements from the government regarding like initiatives and so on. So if anyone is in the industry and can provide anything that can be of use for them or can be very interesting, so do please reach out. I think it's a great moment to work in this environment. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Well, and Tomoko-san, oh, sorry for keeping you waiting. Thank you for coming up.
It's okay, no problem. I've got two things. One is actually right now I'm reading an article from the Business and IT talking about autonomous vehicle, the bus. We'll say that the Japan, because of the rural areas, the public transporting service has got the problem of the finding the drivers to begin with, so that the local government actually welcoming the startups doing experimenting on the autonomous driving bus services, so that it might be quite interesting to read. But because I'm reading through LinkedIn, it's not really helping me to share the information, so that you should try to see business and IT, so that
Business
you can find
and
the
IT?
information about that. And the second thing is that yesterday I had I've been having discussion about the robots actually with several people all over, and it's not only the cars but also anything is the fear for the hacking, and currently several hospitals all over have been introducing different kinds of robots, starting from like delivering or sorting out the medicines to CPRs or rehab. So that there might be quite a big discussion between the professionals in like rehab or the staff doing the CPR, but at the same time, the hospitals have been experiencing the issue of the staff especially because of the COVID, or rehab robot is from Denmark, and Denmark has been experiencing the understaffed issue for rehab, so that the hospitals in the local government are not really welcoming, but needs to have it. But at the same time, the mindset among the professionals is also needed to be changed. So I think the older Rick mentioned that the dystopia that the drivers might be losing the jobs, but not only drivers, but also to any other industry, more or less the similar situation. And also probably it's time to think about the technology will replace the human being, but how we can cope with the lack of staff with technology is something we need to think more than technology is taking over human beings' jobs, so that the people will be jobless kind of mentality. I'm just speaking.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I was thinking to your point about leaving people jobless, and as Rich said, a lot of drivers will lose their jobs. There is one thing, and well, once again, the optimist in me is speaking, but I believe that there will be a lot of new opportunities, and new jobs available as we develop new technologies and new models. The question is how we retrain the people, let's say the drivers who lose their jobs. How can they be, streamlined into a different field of work? And so that, I think that will be the crisis actually. And that will be the problem to solve.
Maya, I'm completely with you. I'm an optimist as well. And when I talked about loss of jobs, really, maybe the phrase I should have used is a shift. I anticipate a massive shift in the economy. And that's where I believe, I don't think the government should take the leading role in figuring out the technology. I think that individuals and entrepreneurship can and will and should do that. But I think the government, meaning the people as represented by the government, should begin debating and thinking about policy changes and shifts and for how to address these inevitable technologies. I don't think it's a matter of choice. I think that technology, when it exists, will take over. We as people need to think about how to respond to that.
Yes, indeed. And that's where we need to think about the future in a futuristic way. Well, it sounds probably a kind of strange way to put it, but yeah.
I agree. I think we only need to look at the the population situation here in Japan, and the aging population. How can those people? I know I'm heading in that direction myself. I don't want to live in Tokyo all my life, but then how do I remain mobile? Like if and how does the rest of the population remain mobile? They want to get from A to B. If there's an option that when I'm in my 70s and 80s and 90s, if I want to go somewhere, I can't rely on someone else. If I can do that by hailing my autonomous cab or whatever it may be, it would be a fantastic option. It takes away the risk of not only me having an accident or going to the wrong place or having to look for my car keys for the 100th time this week.
It happens
Yeah.
to me even nowadays without being that, at that age.
Yeah.
You just got to remember which app to open up. That's going to be the new problem.
Right.
Yeah, it's probably also worth mentioning that we have to make a distinction between the so-called senior population. I'm 64, my wife is 66, but we're pretty comfortable with technology. We use computers, iPads, iPhones. We order online. We're pretty open to change, as opposed to people who are 10, 15 years older than us. My mother-in-law is 90. She doesn't even want to look at an iPad, even if we show her how it's done, right? So I also, I don't think we can lump the elderly population as all being as conservative as the elderly among us.
I agree completely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's going to be more openness
Yes.
to the upcoming population who were here when the internet kind of took over.
I agree with that, and it's also good to note that when we get to the point when these changes will be inevitable, and we will have to retrain and reskill the people who need reskilling. So we'll actually deal with a different generation from the generation who are now 70 or 80 years old, right? And I think that, for example, Tim, your generation and the younger ones, we are already used to dealing with change because the changes have been happening at such a rapid pace here in the.
Yes.
Yes, so maybe it won't be that difficult. I want to believe so. I'm not sure, of course. I want to believe that it won't be that difficult because people are more used to change. But of course, it remains to be seen. And just there are so many things to unpack, to think about. And I'm sure that these things, we can talk about them in future rooms. We're past 9 o'clock. So if you have anything to say in conclusion for today, please do so. Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'd like to say one quick thing in closing. I can see arguments on both sides of, Japan takes forever to change versus Japan adapts when they have to. And to the point, I had a friend who always says, everything you can say about Japan, you can also say the opposite. So you can say the Japanese are risk averse, which I agree with it. But I also think that if the Japanese perceive not changing as riskier than changing, then they'll change. And that's what the black ships did. It forced them to quickly industrialize, learn from, catch up with, and surpass the West. 50 years after Commodore Perry showed up, they had a world-class Navy fleet that blew the Russian Navy out of the water. So they have a precedent for changing, but it has to be based on maybe the dynamic of it's riskier not to change than to change. And time will tell whether this type of technology will happen. I could see it going both ways.
Well, we know we've reached the nadir of the conversation when we've swerved from Nobunaga to the black ships. So,
yes, indeed. Indeed. Very much for coming, Rich, for the theme and for making it the theme of this room. So thank you for joining to everybody, and we're looking forward to seeing you again here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next week on Thursday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you.